integrated shading design, and we're going to start with a little bit of a recap in a way on some of the metrics of daylight. So we have two aspects when we are looking at daylighting. We have quantitative and we have qualitative. So the difference being that quantitative is looking at the actual quantity, the figures, the precise metrics. The qualitative is looking at the quality of space. And we've covered both now, but we've covered particularly the qualitative using the 3D views, the quantitative using the plan views. Okay, daylight factor. So we've covered this before. The daylight factor is the ratio of the internal light level to the external light level, and it's given in %. An assumed overcast sky is used, and orientation has little or no bearing on daylight factor. And we've seen these before, but these are the skies: clear sky, intermediate, overcast. With the clear sky having a much brighter position of the sun in the south, the overcast sky being much more kind of uniform overall. So some key daylighting factors using daylight factor. Okay, for spaces with a daylight factor less than 2%, the room will typically look gloomy. Okay, full electric lighting will often be needed during the daytime, and the electric lighting will dominate the daytime appearance. So less than 2%. So as a designer, for any room which is occupied, you should aim for more than 2%. It's okay if it's a bathroom, if it's a cupboard, okay, but if it's any room which is going to be largely occupied, you should aim for more than 2%. If it's a bathroom in a private dwelling, then you should also aim for 2%. But generally in larger buildings, because you can't put all of your toilets around the outside of the building, generally we'll accept that rooms like toilets, storage cupboards, etc., may have no natural light. Okay, 2% through to 5%, the windows will give a predominantly daylit appearance, but some supplementary electric lighting will be needed. And this is usually the optimum range of daylighting for overall energy use. So 2 to 5% is a good range for you to aim for. 5% or more, and the room will be strongly daylit. And during the daytime, electric lighting is rarely needed, but you could have major thermal problems from overheating due to the large windows. So just some sort of broad guides there. Now if you look back in the lecture on daylighting, which the video is available on Mole for this course, I looked in a lot more detail at the relationship between daylight factor and the percentage of time that you need to switch the electric lights on. Okay. Now the reason that daylight becomes so important nowadays is because electric lighting in Europe is becoming one of the major users of electricity. So our buildings they're becoming better insulated, so they're requiring less and less heating, but so we start to need to minimize the lighting more to make an impact. And then, of course, cooling. If we're allowing too much solar gain, then we move into a cooling situation or an overheating situation. Okay, average daylight factor. So this is the mean average of all the daylight factor points in a room. So what you would need to do is, and this you could only do this using the 3D Studio Max version, you need to add up all those points and divide it by the number of points, and you'll get a mean average. Now, what you can do using the kind of Revit simulation is slightly different, whereas you can look at those simulations and you can make judgments about the quality and the amount of daylight. Yeah, as a guide, a school classroom, you'd be looking for an average of 2%. Uniformity ratio. Now again, you can only work with this metric if you're using the 3D Studio Max analysis where you're getting the data points. And as I've said, that's optional, so you don't all have to. But if you want to get into a little bit more of an advanced level, then you can watch that video and you can start to try that out. I mean, what happened last year is some of the students, when they got into their thesis project over the summer, some of them decided to go back in and learn 3D Studio Max for a more precise kind of daylighting analysis. But they didn't find they needed it necessarily for this module. But obviously, you know, the information's there. So the uniformity ratio, you would calculate by taking the minimum daylight factor in that room and dividing it by the mean average daylight factor. And that gives you a feel for how uniform is that daylight. Do you have particularly dark areas in that room? Is it particularly bright over there and then particularly dark over here? And so, for example, in BREEAM, for a classroom, you're looking for equal or greater than a 0.4 uniformity ratio. Minimum point daylight factor. What's the lowest daylight factor within that room? Okay, and you can get that from Revit using the color codes, or you can get that from 3D Studio Max. And you're looking for simply what's the lowest level of daylight. And for example, in BREEAM, you're saying that no daylight should be lower than 0.8% in that room. And you could simply get that from your, as I say, from your color code in Revit. And then daylight zone is the accepted zone within a room where the daylight criteria must be met. So for example, 80% of the floor area within the center of the room. So what we're saying is if you have a room like this, for example, you might find it acceptable that the zone immediately adjacent to those lockers is not tested for daylight because we're not so interested, along the sort of the wall. If you were in a classroom environment, let's say, and you had storage areas, you don't need to test for daylight in the storage zone. So it's where you're just simply saying, you take a room, and are there particular zones in that room that we need to design for, and are there particular zones that we're not so interested in? And that does depend heavily on the function of that room. So this was, just going back, this was our workflow diagram that we talked about in the very first lecture. Looking at the sort of complexity of all the different tools that we're going to use. Now, we have now covered all of these. We've covered all of these in Vasari, or most of these. And the 3D Studio Max, as I say, that will be covered with a video, but I'm not going to deliver that in a lecture format. Okay. And that 3D Studio Max, we use it purely for daylight analysis. And just as a reminder, as I said right at the beginning, you don't need to understand everything about a software package to use it for design and analysis. So, when we're going through Revit, if you're looking at 3D Studio Max, there are lots and lots of controls, lots and lots of buttons, but you don't need to use them all. You can just use the ones that are helpful to you. Okay, so let's move into Revit. So we're going to start looking at a bit of a workflow in relation to shading design. So let's continue to work with this space that we've been testing. So there's our ground floor. And at the moment we've got all this unshaded glazing, and we've got this little bit of shading here. If I just open the 3D view, I'll just close a few windows down. So there's our ground floor plan on the right, 3D view on the left. So that's how we are at the moment. On the ground floor, we've got all this exposed glazing, and we've got this little bit of shading here. Okay, if I just zoom in on that, you can see it. I'm going to use the shortcut TL, thin lines. So TL just takes you from that, from the thick lines to the thin lines. Okay, just a useful shortcut. And in fact, I'm just going to switch off the shadows so it's a bit easy to see. So there's that little bit of shading that we have there on the building. Okay, and we've been through some analysis, and we were. I'll just go back into that view. We're clearly getting some exceptionally high levels of daylight. So you look at this room here, we're getting above 20%. So really this is telling us it's far too bright in there. It will be difficult to operate. There'll be lots of glare. If you try and work on your laptop, you'll be blinded. There's probably a huge amount of solar gain in that space. Now the workflow that I would suggest is start by working with the daylight. Start by reducing that daylight down. Then you could go back into your energy simulation that we looked at in the class a few weeks ago and start looking at the impact on the energy simulation. Because probably at the moment, all that glazing is bringing a lot of heat into your model. And when you look at your energy analysis charts, I'm sure there's a huge amount of cooling being thrown at that space to keep it cool. So what we want to do is we want to reduce these daylight levels down to an acceptable level, and then we want to hopefully see that has reduced our cooling load on the building. Now, if you were starting from the other way around, where your rooms were too dark, you would not be introducing shading, but you'd be increasing your windows or removing shading. So, for example, these rooms at the back, which they're meant to be toilets, so it doesn't matter. But if that was an office, you would clearly look at that and say, right, well that's it has a 0% daylight factor. We need to increase that. Okay. We've also done some 3D views inside. Now, so apologies, this is a different building, these 3D views. I just threw some ones that I had to hand, okay? So they're actually the wrong building. But if I go into I did render the actual building as well. Yeah, so I just did some quick renderings yesterday. Which I'll kind of show later on, but these are some renderings, 3D views inside the building we're looking at. So there's a sort of visualization, and we've got some daylight. Yeah, so there's a daylight factor, three-dimensional rendering as well. So we've got a good amount of information already, and it's telling us that we need to limit the daylight here. In fact, we've got too much daylight. Let's go back into Revit. Now, if you were operating as a designer, the good thing at this point would be to document this stage. So don't just go changing your design, but actually make a sheet, date it, and record the observations, so that at a later date you can provide that as evidence for why you changed the design, why you increased shading. Bearing in mind that there are cost implications. When your client says, why have you added in all this shading, which is costing me money? You can then use this as evidence to explain why you need to reduce the daylighting levels. Right, let's go back into our, let's just close that one down. Okay. And what we want to do now is we want to start working with some different shading devices. Now, I'm only going to work on the ground floor at the moment. As you can see, the upper floor has some shading, but that would be a different exercise to start to work with that. But looking at the ground floor, let's start to play with the shading. Now, obviously one option on that ground floor would be to have a smaller area of glass. So if we just enlarge that a bit, we've got all that glass. Okay, you could reduce that, but my intuition as a designer says, well, no, because this is a sort of cafe space, seminar space, it's on the ground floor. We want that good sort of visual link. We want people inside to see outside to the plaza. We want people on the plaza to look in and, see the coffee machine and realize, oh, I can get a coffee in there, let's go in. If you think of the cafe in the information commons, you walk past it along the street and you see it and you think, oh, that's good, let's go in there. So although I could reduce the glazing area, I'm going to make a design decision straight away to say, no, I'm going to keep that glazing, because I think that's quite important, okay? Now on the upper floors, if I was looking at the daylighting up there, I might be quite happy to change that window size. But we'll stick with that decision. We're going to keep that glass. I'm going to look at shading it. Right. If I go back to the plan view here, what I could do is just start adding the shading into the plan view now. But I would like to have those as design options so that I can pursue a number of options and I can move between the different options without completely changing my design every time. So it's a bit of a recap because we've covered this before, but we go to Manage at the top and we have Design Options. So let's click on that. And we get this dialog box, which is allowing us to create these different design options in the building. And I've already created a few. Just rename that one. So I'm trying to give them names that have some meaning. So we've got 1B, which is external fixed horizontal. We've got 1A, which is our primary option. We've got 1C, which is external fixed horizontal staggered. Okay, so I've just created these with a sort of hopefully meaningful name. And we can create new. Just hit the new button. Or we can duplicate existing design options, and it will make a copy of that. Okay, go back into our view here, and we can't currently see any of our design options. But if we go hit VV, design options, and we click over here, you might notice, if I do that again, VV, design options, it's a bit irritating that the drop down arrow doesn't appear, so it's not immediately obvious you can change that, but as soon as you click on it, the arrow appears. Okay, so let's just change that to our option 1C, which I quite like. Okay, and if you just look closely there, those shading devices have appeared in the plan view, because I've already modeled those, okay? They're not showing in this 3D view, because those design options are view specific. But let's switch them on in the 3D view. Okay, if I just zoom in a bit. So I've modelled, we've got these sort of timber louvers which are shading the glass a bit, and then there's some steel wires. I've not modelled it, it's not modelled terribly well. I didn't have the time to put all the support structure in, but at this stage I just want to see the effect on the daylight. I'm not really too worried about how they're fixed together. Obviously, if you were spending a bit more time, you could model these much better. So there's some example shades that I've made, okay, and they're now kind of covering that building. If we go to the end view there, we've got that quite a good degree of shading on that end of the building there. Let's go back to that 3D view. Okay, so what I'll do now is, so that's just showing you about design option. What I'll now do is I'll go and we'll create a design option from scratch and start adding some elements into it. So let's go back into our design options, and let's just make a new one. Oops, sorry, that's a set. I didn't want to create a set. New option, and we'll rename it. Let's call it option 1B. Let's call it fixed horizontal throughout, let's say. So let's just say this is an option where we were going to put these louver blades across all the glass. Okay, so I've created that view, that design option, sorry. There it is. Okay. Let's go back into our view here, and I'm just going to change this. Let's do it. Let's copy some elements from this option into our option D. Now, if I hover over, I can select certain elements in this model. As soon as I try and select these shading devices, it won't let me. And that's because they are in a design option, and that design option is not active. So we come back here to our design options. We've actually got to activate the design option that we want to edit. And now what happens is everything in the main model, in the primary option, is grayed out, and I've only got access to edit the elements in this design option. So it's quite a good way of working, because it means you can play about with this design option. You can't accidentally change your main building. So let's say what I want to do is, let's just copy all of that for now. So I've selected all of those shades. You can use Control-C, or you can go up to the copy to clipboard here, copy that. So I've copied that to the clipboard, just deselect that. And let's now move into our design option 1D. Okay, and the thing to note here is, although we've activated design option 1D, we're not viewing it. So let's go VV, design options, and let's view our 1D. Okay, so it can be a bit confusing because you have to both activate it and you have to tell it to view it. And sometimes it's a bit frustrating when you're modeling elements in a design option, you can't see them. It's because you've not made them visible in the view. So I'm in my design option 1D over here. We've copied those elements to the clipboard. So to paste them back, if we go to Modify tab, and let's look at these options under Paste. Hang on. So we've got a few options. Paste from clipboard, but who knows where it will put it. Aligned to the selective levels, so you could paste those elements and choose to put them on a different level in the building. Aligned to the current view, which would be in relation to the current view you've got. Aligned to the same place, or aligned to a picked level, so you could then pick the level. Now for us, we just want them in the same place, so let's click on aligned to same place. If I just zoom in a bit, it's pasted them exactly as they were in option 1C. Okay. Let's just go into our 3D view and view that option as well. Okay. And I find it a very helpful way of working this is to have the plan view and the 3D view open at the same time, because you can see, when you're modeling something, you can see the sort of three-dimensional impact of it. Okay, so we've modeled some of those shades, and let's say for the sake of it, let's just delete a few of those. Let's just delete that one and that one. Okay, so it's deleting it in the 3D view. Okay. And maybe let's just add a few over here. So I'm just going to click on that one there, go into our modify up here, copy, just zoom in a bit so we can see what we're doing. Just copy it from point to point across. So we've copied it across, and let's just move it using the move tool. Click and drag, and I'll type this one in, so I'll type 300, and it moves it 300 mil. Okay, and we know that it's right because we can see it over here in the 3D view as well. Okay, so we've made some changes there to our design option 1D. Let's just hit save. And so we've made those changes, and we now would think, right, we need to have a look at the daylight again. We need to simulate that daylight and see what implication it's made. Okay. So what I'm going to do is we'll go manage, and we'll go back into our main model. Okay, because although we want to test the option 1D, I don't want to edit it anymore. So I don't want to be editing that by mistake. So we'll go back to the main model, and we can still view it. So although we can't, if I zoom in and I can't select those shades now, but I can still view them. Okay. So maybe the first thing to do would be to put a camera in this room. And let's just have a look at the quality of that space. What does it look like with all those shades on? So view, 3D view, camera, click and drag, and let's just have a normal camera in that room. All right. There's the view of that room. We don't see any shades. BV, design options, change it to our 1D. Now we do see the shades. Okay. Also, actually, VV, we know by default that the mass, conceptual masses aren't switched on, so we'll switch that on so that any buildings out there we will see. And let's just click on the extents of that camera view, and let's just widen that perspective a little bit. Okay, probably a bit too wide to be honest, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so we've got a perspective view now. Now, ideally, I think as I showed you last week, these visualizations and these simulations, they have a better quality if you put some furniture in. Okay, this building doesn't have any furniture in at the moment, but There's our camera view, and we can see the effect of those shades. We can immediately switch the shadows on, and let's just change our time of the day. So let's put this on, let's go for the autumnal equinox. The equinoxes are useful because they're, it's not the middle of summer, it's not the middle of winter, they're a sort of good uniform time. Okay. Okay, so there's our first daylight simulation. It's not terribly sophisticated, but what it is telling us, which is good, is that we are getting some light through these louvers. Okay, so when I modelled them, I was a bit concerned that they might be too close together, and I wanted to get this sort of pattern of light through them. The concern was that you'd get no light through them. And, okay, that's giving us, a reasonable level of information there, that we're still getting some nice shadow patterns. We can obviously go back and change that sun. We can do it manually, or we can, as we looked at earlier, you can do that as a solar study. So I'm just moving that sun around and looking at the shadow pattern in that space. Okay, quite nice, quite like that. I think for a cafe area, that might be quite kind of attractive to see that sun tracking round, get that good connection. Quite pleased with that. Let's just go back. Okay. Let's go back to our 10 o'clock, I think. Yeah. Okay, just hit save on that. So at that point, I would suggest you probably would export some JPEGs. Export one of those solar studies. So you've got that range of information about this sort of design option. Now I think what we need to do is let's look at a more accurate visualization. So we'll start cloud rendering again. I can't guarantee that these will be finished before the class ends, but you know the process. So what I would do, what I should have done is rename this view. Let's just do that now, and we'll call it what we're calling this Cafe View Option 1D. And let's go to Render in the Cloud. And let's select the correct view, which is not that view. Cafe View Option 1D. Get rid of that one. Okay. Let's just start with a still image. Final quality, and I'll just do this on 2.25 pixels. Start rendering. Okay, that's gone. Let's do it again. And this time let's do an illuminance render. Let's do it the same size, and we'll do this as a daylight factor sky, and we'll set the legend from 0 to 10 this time, 0 to 10%. Start that rendering. Okay, and what I'd meant to do is also a cloudy day render. So we'll do another still image, quality, final, same size, exposure, sorry, I have to come back out of that. What I'd meant to do is change the sun and do a different render. Let's just do that. Sun settings, let's just put that round to the afternoon. So let's have a look how that looks. Yeah, let's just render that one as well. Still image, final, same size. Okay. And what I'm also going to do is an illuminance render. The reason I'm going to do an illuminance is I'm a little bit worried about the contrast between these bright patches and these dark shadows. I'm a bit worried about that being a bit kind of irritating to the eye. So I'm going to do an illuminance study for a clear sky. So go back into illuminance. And let's do that on 22nd of September. At 1600 hours. And let's do that using a clear sky. And we'll just set the scale to automatic, but we want it in lux, not in foot candles. So that's gone as well. So very quickly, I've done, what have I done? 4 renders there. Okay, off they go. Now we want to, let's look at that plan view for the daylight factor, because I think that gives us a much better sort of metric. So let's find that. Let's find that view, option 1B. So we've already created this 3D view. So this is the camera view that we created earlier. So that's all ready to go, but let's just duplicate that rather than messing around with that. So we'll duplicate that with detailing, and this one, isn't it? Let's just rename that. So there's its view name. So we'll call that level 10 daylight factor study option 1D. Okay. So that should be ready to go. So let's render that one in the cloud as well. Okay, it's the correct option. Let's have an illuminance render, same size, and let's use a daylight factor sky. And again, let's set it from 0 to 10. Yeah.
You don't have to change the visualization option.
Sorry.
In that view, you have to change the visualization because you are looking at option 1D.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. I duplicated the other view, and it's option 1B. I didn't change it to the correct option. Thank you. So let's change this view to look at the correct option. Quite right. Otherwise, we'd have been rendering the same one before. So VV, design options, change it to 1D. Great. So you can see now we've got our 1D shading has appeared. Thanks, Sandra. So let's render that now. 1D illuminance, 2 megapixels. We'll do that as a daylight factor, and let's go 0 to 10. Okay, start that rendering. Now at this point we could do a sort of plan view visualization as well if we wanted. What I will do is an illuminance. Illuminance. Let's do a clear sky. 22nd of December. 22nd of September. Sorry. Let's do that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. clear sky, and we'll just leave the scale on automatic in Lux. Start rendering. Okay, let's go to our render gallery, which I already have open, and we'll just refresh that. Okay. So it's busy with some of those. So start by looking at our daylight factor. Wait a minute. That's not the right one. Sorry. Okay, so they're all still rendering. Okay. So we'll just have to wait a moment. This one's not finished, but at least you can view a thumbnail of it. Okay. But I mean, really, the reason I've gone through all those renders quite quickly there is just to try and kind of impress upon you the speed of the tools that you now have at your disposal. So the fact that I could take an option there and in about 20 minutes conduct a whole series of daylight simulation and visualization to inform my design decisions is hugely powerful. So while those are rendering, I won't go through the whole thing again, but if we went back into Revit now and we said, okay, let's look at the other option. It would be very quick to duplicate the view, VV, change to one of the other options that we were pursuing. Okay, so the shading changed there. It's very difficult to see that, but it did change. I could now start hitting render again, and we'll be getting the simulation in sort of minutes. So I'll just do that one quickly. Daylight factor. Okay. So I've sent that option 1C off to render as well. Let's see if anything's finished yet. The thing is, as well, if you imagine if these were rendering in your own computer, you would have to do one at a time, more than likely, because your computer would be busy rendering, and it would be unlikely that it could accept 5 at any one time. But obviously, because we're doing this on a cloud server, we can send off as many as we want. I'm being a bit slow. Okay. So while we just wait for those, let's just go back into that sheet that we were creating before. Yeah.
Why do we need to enter a new copy of that view?
Of the view.
Directly choose,
Yeah.
choose the option again.
Yeah, let me talk you through that. Okay, just listen everyone. It's a good question. So the question was, why sorry. why do I create a copy of the view rather than just changing the design option in the view? And I mean, you're right, you don't have to. So what I could do here, which I did there, was just to go into the view options, change it from 1D to 1C was what I did. So I'll change it back now. Okay, and that's fine. You can do that. Then you can hit render, and off it will render. The only reason I duplicate it is because it means if I want to use this plan view, I've just got a copy of the view. So that if let's say, for example, I wanted to put that on a sheet to indicate what option 1C looks like, I've not altered my option 1D view, so I've got them both. And in fact, I'll do it now. I'll duplicate it now. Duplicate with detailing. Just rename it. Just do it in the properties. Review copies. This one, isn't it? Just going to rename that to option 1C. Okay. So I've renamed it. So we've now got option 1C and option 1D. And I need to change this to show option 1C. Okay, so that's showing option 1C. That's showing option 1D. Just view them both at the same time. So we've got 1D on the left, 1C on the right. I suppose the only benefit now of having both the views is I could put them both on the same sheet. If we do that now, let's say you were having I'll make a new sheet here. New sheet. So let's say I was having a sheet where I wanted to show the comparison between the two options. There's my empty sheet. I can now if I drag my 1C on first, drop that there, and drag my 1D, it will automatically snap. You see it's snapping to a line vertically. I mean, it's not the best example but yeah, that's the benefit of duplicating the views. You could then put both views on the same sheet. And if it was a 3D view, for example, it would show you a lot more because you could very quickly show 1C, show 1D. And it could be quite a good way of demonstrating this to then maybe not like that. Maybe if you put this alongside like that, then maybe you would put the different simulations below it, and maybe let's have a 3D view. Where's my 3D view? Let's just drag that on as well. I mean, I'd have to scale that to the right size, but you could very quickly put on a whole range of views to give this comparison information on the same sheet. So if I'll go back into my render, see if anything's finished. Okay, so that was one of the 3D views I did with the shading in place. It's a little bit harder to read 3D views, but what it is telling you is that compared with the previous version with the no shading, we're not getting such a huge bright patch of sunlight adjacent to the windows. Now you notice you don't see through the windows in this type of simulation because it's telling us about the level of light on the glass. Okay, so there's a sort of helpful visualization already. We've got one of our 3D renderings has finished. So there was the option, I think that's option 1C, can't remember. So that's, I'll just enlarge that. I'll download it and enlarge it. So, as I say, it's not got any furniture in it. It's not modelled in a lot of detail either, but it is giving you a sort of bit of a quality of what that shadow pattern might be like inside. It would be better if you had more detail in there. And the other ones are not ready yet. Okay, but it doesn't really matter. I think the point was to do a quick demonstration about how quickly you can now try different shading designs and get results that can inform your design decisions and get the evidence that you can use, so that when in your situation let's say as a student, when you're trying to demonstrate why you have this shading design, you've got the evidence to say, well, here's looking at the daylight, here's looking at the visualizations. This I just think you might just say, well, I just think it looks amazing. It'd be really interesting. So you've got all of that. Now, I'm not going to do it now, but what you could do is now go back into Revit and run the energy analysis with the different shading and see if that shading is changing your energy performance of your building. And again, as we've shown before, that's done very quickly. So, for example, what you might do is you might have a sheet. I think you'd need these all much smaller, but you might have a sheet like this where you talk about daylight and you talk about energy analysis on the same sheet, comparing two different options.